There were two battles which were going on in the 80s and the 90s, which are relevant to this. I've put them up there. The first was between livelihood and employment. The word livelihood was used a certain amount in the 1970s, and I think Andrew Pearce was involved in this, and quite likely other people like Michael Lipton, but I haven't traced them all back. But the dominant thinking of economists was urban-based, industry-based, job-based. It was employment, and part of the battle was to replace the word employment with the word livelihood, because livelihood seemed to represent and encompass much more the complex, diverse realities of poor people than employment did, because most of them would not be employed. And just to give you an idea of that battle, in the run-up to the 1995 Social Development Summit in Copenhagen, there was a background paper written which was absolutely stuffed with the words, employment 28 times, unemployment 11 times, underemployment 5 times, jobs 6 times, and workforce 4 times. So there was a battle to try to get livelihoods in there. And so they changed the title and put in livelihoods, but it was only used once more in the whole document. All the rest of it stayed in the old mindset of employment. And there was another document which had the word jobs 13 times on the same page. So there was this very, very dominant mindset. And I think the Social Development Summit was actually a key moment when a lot of this got overturned in terms of the discourse. So that was one battle that was going on. And linked with this was the way in which the complexity of people's lives, poor people's lives, and the multiple activities were screened out by conventional questionnaire surveys, where very often there was principal occupation, which was agriculture, tick, and then the incentive for the investigator or the enumerator was simply to go on. And many of the things that people did, which put together a livelihood, were excluded. So it was all part of trying to become more real about the lives and priorities of poor people. Well, then, what I think it's important to recognise that IIED had an absolutely crucial role in this, and particularly Richard Sandbrook. In 1985, Richard Sandbrook adopted this idea of sustainable livelihoods and ran with it. And there was a big conference in 1987 in Regent's Park, which led to this book, The Greening of Aid, Sustainable Livelihoods in Practice, which is 1988. So the idea was around actually 2 decades ago, and in quite a big way, because the research which went into this had sustainable livelihoods as one of the rubrics which was being used. And the other early introduction was for the World Commission on Environment and Development, the Brundtland Report, in which there was a committee which was on food security, agriculture, forestry and fisheries, I think it was, chaired by M.S. Swaminathan. And M.S. Swaminathan picked up on sustainable livelihoods and talked about sustainable livelihood security. That was the rubric that he used, and that went into the report, and sustainable livelihoods got into the Brundtland report as well. So the idea got lodged really quite early, but then there was some sort of hiatus, and nothing very much seems to have happened. Oxfam actually came to IDS. They sent a delegation here in the early 90s, saying that they wanted to take up sustainable livelihoods as a focus, and we had and I mean, personally, I was rather embarrassed because it wasn't much more than a label. That we hadn't really developed the idea very much. But anyway, Oxfam picked it up. And then there's a whole range of organisations, IFPRI, DFID, CARE, UNDP, IFAD, as well as Oxfam, and of course IDS itself to some extent. So it spread in the 80s. The words spread really quite rapidly. I think the really significant breakthrough was what we call the Scoons diagram. I mean, it was the diagram that Jörn devised, which was in relation to a research project that you had. Is that right? Which actually put some flesh on, or some categories on, which had not been there before, so that it became something that was usable. And I think that was the really big breakthrough. All right. The other battle was about sustainability and discounting, and this again was a battle with economists. That the moment you start thinking about sustainability, discounting makes no sense. In fact, you could even argue that you should discount negatively, that you should value the future more than the present.
Robert, could you explain a bit more what you mean by discounting?
Yes, well, discounting, if you... the present value, for an economist, present value is calculated by taking future benefits and reducing them. Say, supposing that you're discounting at 10%, you reduce them by 10% year by year by year. So if you take the value in 20 years' time, discounting at 10% of something which is going to cost £1 million now, you come up with something like £10,000. I mean, I made the figures up. But a very, very low present value, which means that you are actually giving the future a lower value than the present. And this leads to very, very bad decisions, for instance, about nuclear power stations. Because, I mean, the cost of decommissioning a nuclear power station seemed to be negligible. Present value seemed to be negligible at the time when they were installed, particularly because 10% was being used in those days. So is that good? So that was another battle that was going on. And then, well, there's this question: why did the idea take off?